Here's how I made this short little VFX scene for my friend's comedy sketch. Walk, freeze, flop. Then I used masks and the key light effect to isolate me from the background and pre-compose this with the attributes, so I basically had a layer of just me. Then I made 3 copies of this layer and moved the playhead to the time where I freeze. On one layer, I right-clicked and went to Time, Freeze Frame, then put a simple mask isolating just the legs. On another layer, I isolated just the top half of me, using a combination of masks and a whole bunch of the color key effect to get rid of the skin tones and leave me with just underpants. The last normal copy will just remain normal, and we can fade this out to get rid of the legs. For the legless top, we'll add position keyframes to fall all the way down instead of to my crouched position. Similarly, I'll use mesh warp to force my hands to go all the way to the ground rather than floating where they were. And a little liquify to ripple my legless undies so they flap around as I fall. Now for the fun part, making 2D legs 3D.
Oh no, 3D, isn't that complicated and or expensive?
Blender to the rescue! Now making 3D stuff out of real world stuff is also known as photogrammetry or photo scanning. And there are some really interesting techniques to do this if you capture from multiple camera angles or record video and use certain plugins, like Mesh Room. Shout out to CG Geek for some great tutorials on that. He is just nuts. But if you only have one image, here's a quick cheat. Export a PNG of these frozen legs, then bring that into Illustrator. First thing I'm going to do in Illustrator is crop down the artboard just to the object. Then I'm going to go to Image Trace. In the settings, I crank up the threshold until it is solid black. In the advanced settings here, make sure you turn on Ignore White so that the transparent areas of the PNG stay transparent, which you can see with transparency grid on. This looks great. Go ahead and export as SVG. Blender. All right, for those of you who are new to Blender, like me, something weird about it is there are a lot of options called add-ons that are turned off by default, and you gotta turn them on. The 3 add-ons we're gonna need are Import SVG, cause duh, Cell Fracture, so we can break the legs apart, and Node Wrangler, which is gonna be a huge help when adding realistic rock texture. All right, let's press Delete to get rid of the default cube, and then go to File, Import to get that SVG. Now that it's imported, look at it, it's tiny. We're going to scale it up by pressing S on the keyboard and just sliding the mouse to do a universal scale. I'm going to press R and then X and 90 to rotate 90 degrees on the X axis. I'm going to press G for grab and then X so I can slide it left on the X axis. And then I'm going to right click and go to Set Origin to 3D Cursor, which is basically resetting the anchor point to the middle of the scene. Right now the legs are black because that's the color they were in Illustrator. So we can go down here to the Materials tab and change the base color to the medium gray, which is helpful for just a lot of reasons. If you press Tab to switch from object mode to edit mode, we can see that these legs are technically a curve made out of vertices. So basically it's technically 2D. But if we go down to the curve properties, we can extrude it. You want to hold Shift to get more fine adjustment, which is the opposite of After Effects. Now curves are great, but really not helpful when it comes to sculpting. Rather than just an outline of vertices, we'd rather have an entire mesh that wraps around the object. And so we're going to right click on the object and go to Convert to Mesh. All right, now if I tab into edit mode, we certainly see vertices are on all of the faces. I'm going to go to the side view and then turn on X-ray so I can see and then select vertices that are even behind ones in the front. I'm selecting all the vertices for my backside and then pressing R and X and moving the mouse a bit to rotate that backside and give me a bit of an ass, which is helpful later on for sculpting. Speaking of sculpting, right now our vertices are kind of all over the place, connecting randomly to each other, creating these really kind of random faces. And this is a problem when it comes to sculpting because by default, sculpting pulls and pushes on these faces. So it's going to be really chunky and strange unless we fix this. So basically what we need to do is retrace this object in a new mesh. If we go to the modifiers tab, there's a modifier called remesh. Oddly enough, even though this modifier technically adjusts the vertices and faces, we need to be in object mode to see the actual effects live. Don't worry if everything looks terrible right off the bat. We're going to change some properties, starting with the type, we're going to change to sharp, and then the other 2 properties, octatree depth and scale. Octatree depth is kind of like an exponential multiplier of how many vertices you have. So you really need to watch out that you don't go too high on this number or Blender will definitely crash your computer. I found that 6 was pretty good for me. Now, scale is kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. A higher scale gives you more smaller faces, and a smaller scale gives you fewer larger faces. Now, since modifiers only preview in object mode, you're only going to see these faces once you apply the modifier with this little drop down or Control A, and then tab over into edit mode. In the end, you want your faces to look something like this, not this, which even though my computer can handle it, is way too dense. You don't have to worry too much about things looking a little chunky or blocky in Blender because there's always the option to add smooth shading, either by right-clicking and going to Shade Smooth, or in various effects and modifiers, there'll be a little checkbox. Now the big question is how to go from Gumby legs to kind of realistic legs, and stress on the kind of here. I'm really just trying to go for rock here, and I'm just going to use quick and dirty methods to get us close. The method I used was to just jump right into the Sculpt tab. Before I started sculpting, I turned off mirror mode and turned on Dynotopo, which stands for dynamic topography, meaning when you sculpt, it has the ability to add or subtract vertices, adding detail where it's necessary, and I just found it was good. The detail size though is important, and you don't want to go too high or too low. Actually doing the sculpting using the default draw tool is actually pretty intuitive. Anywhere you click and drag will push on the model, and if you do the same thing while holding shift, it will pull. You can change the radius and strength of your brush up at the top or by right clicking. And yeah, I just spent a few minutes playing around with it, smoothing out the harsh edges, pushing and pulling wherever necessary, with one caution being that I never pushed or pulled on the outer edge or inner edge because I wanted to maintain the profile view from the front, which matched my original photo. It's about time we start trying to line these legs up with the original scene. For that, we're going to need a camera, which we already have. We can click the camera button to go into camera view or press numpad 0. Now down here in the camera settings, we can go to background image, turn it on, and then grab our reference image. Now, of course, the relative distance of the object and the camera is totally out of whack, and we need to move the camera. There are a few different ways we can do this. In a different perspective view, we can move the camera using the same grab and rotate keyboard shortcuts and all that. But that's kind of a shot in the dark. We can also use the normal view adjustment controls using the middle mouse, Control, Shift, and all that good stuff to set up our normal view. Then press Control, Alt, numpad 0 to move the camera to the current view. And this is much closer, but not perfect. The third and my favorite way to move the camera, especially for lining up precise things like this, is to go into the view options by pressing N and turning on camera to view. This way we can use the normal view adjustment controls with the mouse and modifiers, moving our view and at the same time also our camera. And we can adjust this until things look pretty good. My legs are pretty much in the right place, and I'm also paying a bit of attention to the grid lines on the ground and matching them up with the floor in my image. And while I had this set up, I took a little bit of time to continue lining things up using the grab tool in the sculpt mode. To make larger bulk adjustments like twisting the leg, I would tab over into edit mode with X-ray on and select a bunch of vertices. The key thing here was to turn on the proportional editing button so that when I move the selected vertices, there's a gradual fall off of adjustment to nearby vertices. All right, textures. First, we're gonna head to Texture Haven and grab one of these free awesome texture packs. They got like 10 friggin' packs just for rocks. Now I say packs because the zip you download not only has rock image, but a few other JPEGs that Blender will use to enhance the way the texture is displayed, like response to lights and even 3D roughness. All right, back in Blender over in the Materials tab, let's get rid of this default texture and add a new one and a new default BSDF material. Now, if you wanted the quick and lame way to add a texture, you can just click this little dot next to base color and choose image texture. Browse and find the diffuse image texture from your pack, which is the main rock image. No. Right off the bat, something is clearly wrong, and it's not because I'm in the wrong shader either. In material preview or rendered view, it's just brown, which would be fine if it was a kindergartner's drawing of a rock, but no, where's the detail? Where's the texture? This is where we need to hop over to the Shading tab. In the lower left panel, I'm going to change the viewport to display a UV editor, and then I'm going to load up our image texture. The U and V in UV editor stand for the X and Y coordinates of this 2D image. Why don't we just use X and Y for X and Y? Because X and Y were too busy hanging out in 3D space, so we get stuck with these phony balonies. Anyway, this little area is showing us how we're mapping the 2D image to our, well, not our object, but the faces of the surface. This is why we need to tab over into edit mode and select all the vertices or faces, making sure we have X-ray or just pressing A to get them all. The UV editor is still not showing us how it's being mapped. Pause, mini tutorial time. If we had a simple shape like a cube and added the texture the same way we did to our legs, all would actually be well in Flatland, and we could easily see how the 3D faces are unwrapped onto this flat unfolded 2D plane. And I could mess around with the vertices and stuff, and it kind of knows how to adapt. But as soon as I go into sculpt mode and turn on Dynotopo, which we know adds all those fancy new polygons, we're going to confuse the heck out of Blender, and it won't know how to properly unfold our new mutant cube to match our 2D image. This is exactly what happened with our legs and their super dynamically topographized mesh we made. Luckily, there are options to retrain Blender into unwrapping our complex shape. They're all found in the UV menu or right click. It's usually referred to as projecting. Imagine you're taking your image texture and turning it into a stretchy latex, and then just sort of slapping and wrapping it around your object. By choosing different projection modes, you can imagine Blender is kind of inflating your object into a cube or a cylinder, splatting the texture onto that, and then letting it shrink back to its original shape. Projecting from view is probably the best option for us, especially since we're going to be mostly looking at the legs from the front. Project from view doesn't do any of this imaginary deforming and just splats your texture direct onto the current form and wraps around back. The only problems you can get are streaking in areas perpendicular to the view that we're kind of splatting from. The advantage is that the front looks great and has no seams. Seams in most modes will be kind of inevitable unless you have a perfectly looping texture, which this isn't. So in my version, I went with project from view. And now the UV editor is showing me roughly where the selected 3D vertices are relating to my 2D image texture. If I scale these vertices in the UV editor by pressing S and sliding the mouse, I'm essentially using more of the image. I get a higher resolution and sort of shrinking the texture on our object, which actually kind of makes it look bigger. If I go the other way and shrink our object on the UV map, I get a lower res, but might be a good idea if I wanted a smaller part of the original texture to take up more of the legs, making them look smaller, like the size of a pebble. All right, UV mapping solved, finally. Now let's talk nodes and how using a single image texture looks kind of flat and lame. In the node editor, we can see we've got an image texture node plugged into the base color, and that's it. All the other properties like roughness and lighting are manual right now. But what if we decided to use those other images we downloaded to drive those properties? Genius! You can technically do this the hard, stupid way by duplicating the image node, loading the other images, and plugging them all into the right spots. Or you can just open the side column here by pressing N and using that badass add-on we added earlier called Node Wrangler. We click our main BSDF, and then we can either click Add Principled Setup or just press Ctrl-Shift-T, which is a shortcut for that. Then we select all our images in the pack and hit OK. Blender knows exactly what to do with all of them and where to plug them in. Isn't that freaking awesome? In the render tab, we can see that it's not only responding to the lights, but also the bumpiness is causing shadows. It's just so much more realistic. People who are better than me at nodes would probably keep going, but I think this just looks perfect. All right, time to break it apart. The cell fracture add-on we added earlier shows up when you select your object and go to the object menu and look under quick effects. To change the scale of the shatter bits, you don't go to scale. That just changes the aspect ratio of the bits. For more smaller bits, you increase the source limit on the number of bits. But be careful not to go too high or your computer will melt down. But the idea here is that you actually can't see the result until you hit OK. If you don't like it, undo, go back, change some stuff, and try again. But what's with these stupid glitchy lines? Well, cell fracture actually leaves you an unshattered copy hiding behind your shattered bits in case you want to do fancy things, but this is just going to get in our way, so you either need to delete it or turn off its visibility. If you do turn off the visibility, you also need to turn it off in render as well. Now, as much as it pains me, I am deleting my crotch here because I'm just having my legs fall out of the underpant holes. Now, to make them bits crumble, first we're just going to make a plane and scale it up for the ground. Now for the physics. Floors and rocks are pretty rigid bodies, so we're going to need to go to the Object menu or Physics tab and give the floor a passive rigid body so it doesn't respond to gravity, and then the rocks an active one so they do. Guys, it's really that easy. Isn't this freaking cool? Obviously, you can tell I'm new because this simple shit still makes me feel like a god, but yeah, I can't get enough of this stuff. I'm going to shatter everything. Don't get in my way if you're a polygon. This is a little more spewy and I want more splody. The easiest way to add pop to your crumble is to give all your bits a collision margin in the physics properties. But this is only making one bit splody. Pause, mini tutorial. When you select a bunch of junk in Blender, there's always one bit that's special. Either the last one you click or the first one, but it's ever so slightly glowier. That is your active object, and it's the only one that you're technically adjusting in these properties tabs over here. Then how do you get those rigid body settings on the other junks? We go under the object menu, rigid body, and then copy from active. This not only copies from active, duh, but also pastes to all the other selected things, which is not so duh. Now, unfortunately, if you want to make a change, you have to make a change to 1 and repeat this whole copy from active again. Yeah, I know. I think that's lame. I've scoured the internet for a better solution, and the best thing I found was the ability to just right-click any item in any menu and go to Add to Quick Favorites. Then later, all you have to do is press Q for this small list to show up, which is pretty awesome. And guys, this could be almost the end of the physics story if I wasn't such a damn perfectionist. In my original video, I react to one leg breaking, then the other, and then I fall. So the question is how to delay the shattering for specific bits. First off, we're going to group these bits into collections. You can select the bits and press M to put them in a new collection. Left bits, right bits, other bits. Now, I'll select one bit from a bunch and press Shift-H to solo it. Now, I'm over here in the properties area, and any property with a dot over on the right can be animated, including dynamic. In other words, whether or not the thing is frozen or not. I just have to pop a keyframe over here with it on, and then another one over here with it off, and bam! Time-triggered animated physics. Now, to give this animation to the others in the collection, you might expect we have to do the same right-click, copy from active, but no! For this, there actually is a much better solution. We select all the objects in the group, go to Object, Make Links, or Control-L, and then Animation Data. The coolest thing here is that not only do all of our bits in your bunch go at the same time now, but their keyframes are all linked, meaning if you just want to adjust one of those bits, all the others change automatically. Isn't that cool? I just repeated this trick for each collection, animating one, linking the rest, and then timing each of the collections to fall with slight delays. All right, the last thing I did was lighting. I'm not a pro at this, but it seems very similar to After Effects. I just made 3 area lights, kind of matching the position and angle of the windows in the photo, plus 1 to illuminate the front. The cool thing about area lights is that the bigger you make them, the softer they cast, just like in real life. Speaking of casting things, the shadows are always kind of lame when you're rendering with Eevee. We're going to switch to cycles here in the render tab and let it sparkle in some beautifully rendered soft shadows. Another awesome thing we can only get in cycles is the ability to go into the Object Properties tab for the floor and turn its visibility to be a shadow catcher. So we get the shadows only, very similar to an option in After Effects. But this is still being stupid. ¿Por qué? By default, Blender renders nothing as gray. If we truly want nothing to be transparent, we have to go to the render settings and under Film, go figure, turn on transparency. Shazam! Guys, we are so close to that render button, I can almost taste it. But just a few quick things before rendering. Make sure to set your final scene length here. And, these little bits have stopped moving, even though the video is still playing. We gotta go hunt down that one annoying little setting. It's called Rigid Body World. No, that's not it. Let's head back to Blender. You'll find it under the scene settings. And we just have to make sure that the cache is at least as long as our scene, so the physics continue through the scene. Back in the render settings, we're going to make sure we're outputting as PNG image sequence with RGB alpha. And as for CPU versus GPU rendering, I personally find with my GTX 1070 and an i7 8700K CPU, I find GPU renders about twice as fast. But y'all might want to run some tests on your own, rendering just a still image before finally clicking that sweet, juicy render animation button. Time for a coffee break. Oh yeah, that's right. I actually hate coffee and it makes me sick. That was weird. Back to After Effects. I import it as image sequence, then slap the rock legs under my top and over my bottom. I use some timer mapping to line up the crackling with my acting. Now, also the default pose wasn't a perfect match, so I fudged it with some Liquify. Speaking of not matching, look at all this leg movement that I just totally did not include in my Blender animation because I'm not that good yet. I am, however, pretty damn good at fudging things in After Effects, which is really kind of what the program's all about. I put a nice big mask on the leg video so that when I used the Puppet Pin tool to make the adjustments, the mesh was big enough to include all the actions instead of tightly wrapping the legs, which would have messed things up when they animated. I keyframed the pins to force the legs to move with my real legs, and I really didn't worry too much about the lineup at the very beginning, because that's where my plan was to have the rock transition up my legs. Nice. Now for that transition, I made a separate shape layer with a vertical gradient and added the fractal noise effect and set it to, how about Rocky? I then set the blend mode to overlay so I get this kinda crackly gradient. I then turned its visibility off since we'll be simply using it as a matte. And then I added the gradient wipe transition to the legs. I set the gradient layer to be my gradient matte layer. All I had to do then was animate the transition amount. And I think it looks pretty sick. Lastly, a little tweaking with curves and HLS color balance to correct some color, maybe a little layer styles to cheat in some extra 3D-ness, and finally, this is how I made this freaking little video. If you want to see how this clip got used in the original comedy sketch by my good friends over at Weird Local Productions, Advanced Education for Average Adults Episode 4 is hilarious and totally insane. I put a link in the description, so go check them out.
Job's done.
And a huge thanks to my patrons who get to watch all my tutorials as soon as they come out. You can ask me questions about them or any videos I've made, and I try to answer all your questions. You can also get access to my assets in case you want to do something silly with my crackling rock legs. You can make your own legs fall apart. Do whatever you want. Have at it. Just remember to tag me if you use those. And if you do become a patron, I can't thank you enough. You guys allow me to make more of these videos faster, better, and just we'll keep them coming. Thank you guys so much.